They thought she didn't belong. A young woman, barely over 5 feet tall, walked into the Special Forces selection center in the room, erupted in laughter. To them, she looked like someone's little sister who had wandered in by mistake, not a soldier about to face the most brutal training in the military. But that day, under the harsh fluorescent lights and the mocking eyes of 200 men, something extraordinary began. They laughed until she broke every record they believed was unbreakable. What they didn't know was that Claire Donovan carried more than strength in her frame, she carried a fire. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why no one ever laughed at her again. The fluorescent lights above the Special Forces recruitment hall flickered slightly, casting sharp shadows across the polished concrete. Nearly 200 towering candidates filled the space former athletes, combat veterans, and men built like iron walls. Among them, a young woman in scuffed hiking boots and a faded gray hoodie stood out like a misplaced puzzle piece. Her name was Claire Donovan, and at just 5 feet 2 inches with a slender frame, she looked more like someone headed to a yoga class than the military's most grueling selection program. A ripple of snickers moved through the room as she approached the registration desk, clutching an old, battered gym bag. "Did someone's little sister get lost?" whispered Jake Morrison, a broad-shouldered ex-Marine standing nearby. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. Morrison's reputation preceded Hyman, Ohio State linebacker turned military bruiser who radiated arrogance. A few of his followers chuckled, the kind of laughter that sticks like burrs to the skin. The intake officer, Staff Sergeant Williams, looked at Claire's paperwork, then back at her with raised eyebrows. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "are you absolutely certain you're in the right place? This is Special Operations Selection. We're not looking for administrative staff today." His tone dripped with disbelief, like he was humoring her before sending her home. Claire didn't flinch. "I'm in the right place, Sergeant," she replied quietly, her voice calm, but carrying an edge that silenced even the closest whispers. Williams shrugged, sliding a medical clearance form across the table. "Your funeral, kid. Fitness assessment starts in 15 minutes. Bay 3. As she walked away, she could feel their eyes on her back, the dismissive stares, the whispered bets about how fast she would fail. Morrison leaned toward his crew, smirking. "I give her 30 minutes. Tops. She'll be crying before the first set of burpees." The fitness bay was alive with testosterone-fueled bravado. Candidates were stretching, shadowboxing, and showing off in impromptu push-up contests. Claire moved to a quiet corner, away from the noise, and began her warm UPA sequence of fluid, deliberate stretches that looked almost like a dancer preparing for a performance. Morrison scoffed. "Check out the yoga instructor," he muttered. "Hope she brought a mat." When the call for the first pull-up test came, Morrison and his buddies leaned against the wall, phones ready to record what they assumed would be her humiliation. The bar hung high above, 8 feet off the ground. Claire jumped lightly, fingers locking around the cold steel. "Sweetheart," Morrison called out mockingly, "don't hurt yourself." What happened next silenced the room. Claire pulled herself up, smooth and steady. 1 pull-up, then 2, then 5. Her form was flawless, her breathing controlled. 10, 15. The laughter stopped. Morrison's grin faded. At 20, the room was dead silent. She dropped to the ground like a cat landing on its feet, barely breathing hard and without a single glance toward the gawking crowd, moved on to the next station. By the end of the day's tests, 3 men had already dropped out injuries, fatigue, or bruised egos. Claire remained, not dominating every event, but performing with such quiet precision that the instructors began to exchange curious looks. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sergeant Mills gathered the survivors. "Congratulations," he said, scanning the group. "Day 1's over. 147 days left. Most of you won't last the week." His eyes lingered on Claire, just for a second. Was it doubt? Or something else, something closer to curiosity? That night, lying on a narrow bunk while the others whispered about her, Claire allowed herself a faint smile. They weren't laughing anymore. But this was only the beginning. The 3rd week of selection arrived like a hammer striking steel. The remaining candidates were gaunt and hollow-eyed, stripped of the arrogance they'd carried on day 1. The legendary Hell Week was about to begin 5 relentless days designed to crush even the strongest wills. Of the original 200 candidates. Only 63 remained. Claire Donovan stood quietly among them, her expression unreadable beneath the early morning fog. At 4 a.m., Sergeant Mill's voice thundered across the parade ground. "Listen up, maggots. For the next 5 days, you belong to me. You'll eat when I say eat, sleep when I say sleep, and quit when your pathetic bodies can't take another step. The mountains don't care about your feelings, and neither do I." Claire felt the tension ripple through the formation. Around her, some men trembled from exhaustion. Others wore a mask of defiance, but their eyes betrayed fear. Morrison, towering as always, stood just a few feet away. His once smug face now looked weathered, lips cracked from dehydration. Yet his eyes still burned with something that looked like resentment every time they landed on her. Their first challenge was night navigation through the Widow's Peak Trail, system 30 miles of brutal wilderness. No trails, no lights, just a map, a compass, and an 8-hour time limit. Miss the checkpoint, and you were out. The trail was notorious for breaking people, with its steep cliffs, narrow crevices, and thick underbrush that snagged and tore at even the best equipment. The whistle blew. Chaos erupted as the candidates charged into the dark like stampeding cattle. Claire did not. She took a deep breath, studying her map with the same focus she'd once used scaling the cliffs of Colorado. While others crashed through the forest like wounded bulls, their heavy boots snapping twigs and branches, she slipped quietly into the night swift, silent, and deliberate. Her size, once mocked, became her greatest advantage. She slid through narrow rock gaps that forced bigger men into exhausting detours. She climbed small ridges to scout her route, her movements as fluid as water. Hours passed. The cold mountain air burned her lungs, but she didn't falter. Every step was precise. Calculated, she moved with the confidence of someone who had lived in wild places before. Meanwhile, Morrison was already struggling. His massive frame, which made him a hero on the football field, now worked against him. "Where the hell is that little mouse?" he grunted to Thompson, another hulking candidate. The two men were scratched and bleeding from trying to bulldoze through thorny underbrush. "She's not even human," Thompson panted. 3 hours into the exercise, Claire reached her first major obstacle, a 60-foot vertical rock face blocking the direct route to Checkpoint Alpha. Several candidates stared up at it, muttering curses, and chose to detour, adding miles to their path. Claire dropped her pack, studying the wall under the faint beam of her headlamp. She saw handholds where others saw nothing but jagged stone. Without hesitation, she began to climb. Every movement was poetry, legs pushing, hands finding perfect balance, body weight distributed with the precision of a professional climber. Within 12 minutes, she was at the top, while the others below were still arguing about the safest way around. She took a deep breath, scanning the lights flickering far below, and realized she had just gained a 2-hour advantage. By dawn, her body was caked in sweat and dirt, but her spirit burned brighter than ever. She reached Checkpoint Alpha just as the timing official looked up from his clipboard. "Rodriguez, no, wait," he squinted. "Donovan, you're 3 hours early. That's impossible." "Is there a problem with my time, sir?" she asked calmly, as if arriving early was the most natural thing in the world. He shook his head. "No problem, but you just broke the record. No one's ever completed this trail in under 7 hours. The record was 6 hours, 43 minutes. You just did it in 5 hours and 18 minutes. One by one, other candidates stumbled in bleeding, limping, eyes wide when they saw Claire already sitting cross-legged near the fire, sipping water, her pack neatly beside her. Morrison arrived an hour after the cutoff, his arms covered in scratches. He froze when he saw her. "Ow," was all he managed to say before collapsing in exhaustion. The murmurs started that evening. No one was betting on her failure anymore. The conversation had shifted. The girl they'd laughed at had become a ghost story among the men. Every time she stepped forward, people whispered, "Who is she, really? How could she be this good?" Sergeant Mills, who had spent 20 years watching candidates break down and fail, began to study her with quiet interest. As darkness fell on the second day of Hell Week, the whispers grew. Claire didn't boast, didn't argue, didn't even acknowledge her victories. She simply kept moving forward silent, focused, and unshakable. By the 7th week of selection, only 23 candidates remained. What had begun as a room full of swaggering athletes and seasoned veterans had been whittled down to a handful of worn-out survivors. Yet, in the middle of the exhaustion and bruises, Claire Donovan seemed to grow sharper, more composed like steel forged in fire. The whispers had turned into murmurs of awe. No one laughed anymore. Even Morrison, once the loudest voice of ridicule, now kept his distance, stealing glances at her with a mix of resentment and disbelief. The next challenge was a brutal underwater demolition tested trial infamous for eliminating even the toughest recruits. The lake that morning looked like a sheet of black glass, its surface whipped by icy winds. The temperature hovered at a bone-numbing 42 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to sap a man's strength within minutes. The candidates stood shivering on the rocky shore as Chief Petty Officer Barnes addressed them. "Your mission is simple," Barnes barked, holding up a waterproof timer. "Swim 200 meters out, dive 40 feet down, plant these explosive charges on the submerged platform, and return to surface. No tanks. No excuses. Fail to complete the dive or require rescue, and you're done. Understand?" The men exchanged uneasy looks. This was the kind of test that left scars not on the body, but on the mind. Claire's dive partner was Derek Sullivan, a former college swimmer with broad shoulders and a fading sense of confidence. As they tightened their straps and adjusted their masks, Derek whispered nervously, "No offense, but maybe you should go first so I can pull you out if you get in trouble down there." Claire simply nodded, her face calm. She had been here before, not this exact lake, but in situations where oxygen was scarce, where fear clawed at the lungs. Growing up in the high-altitude towns of Colorado had taught her to control her breathing and embrace the stillness of silence. While others saw panic, she saw rhythm. One by one, candidates entered the water. Morrison went first, his muscles trembling from the cold. He barely lasted a minute before surfacing, gasping, unable to even find the platform. Others followed, some failing to attach the charges, others surfacing in panic as the cold crushed their chests like a vice. The instructors' faces remained stone cold, scribbling notes as the failures piled up. When it was Claire's turn, something in the air shifted. A crowd of off-duty instructors gathered on the shore, curiosity drawn by the buzz surrounding her. Morrison smirked through chattering teeth. "Bet the mouse finally drowns," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Claire waded into the freezing water, her movements unhurried. She floated on her back for almost 3 minutes, eyes closed, taking deep, measured breaths. It was as if the world had slowed just for her. Then, with one smooth motion, she inverted and began her descent. Underwater, the cold was shocking but familiar. Her compact frame cut through the water like a blade. She reached the platform quickly, hands steady as she began attaching the explosive charge. The task required precision, and calm a single mistake could mean disqualification. Above, Chief Barnes checked his stopwatch. 2 minutes. 3. 4. "Is she still down there?" one of the instructors muttered, leaning over the water with wide eyes. At 4 minutes and 30 seconds, Claire began her ascent, controlled and graceful. She broke the surface without a gasp, without panic, just calm, steady breathing. "Charge attached and armed, sir," she reported, her voice firm. Chief Barnes stared at his timer. For minutes and 38 seconds. His jaw tightened. That's not possible. The record was 3:47. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. Sullivan, standing waist-deep and waiting for his turn, could only whisper, "How?" It was a question on everyone's mind. For the first time, Morrison didn't laugh. He didn't say a word. His pride had been dismantled one record at a time, and now all he could do was stare at Claire as if seeing her for the first time. Later, in the briefing room, Sergeant Mills addressed the remaining candidates. His voice was low but carried an unusual weight. "You all think you're strong, but strength isn't just muscle. Strength is what doesn't break when everything else shatters." His gaze landed on Claire. "Some of you might want to take notes." The real test, however, was still to come. A challenge whispered about in mess halls and training camps, a trial known simply as the gauntlet, and it would push every last ounce of willpower to the brink. The dawn before the gauntlet was heavy with tension. The remaining 12 candidates stood in a dimly lit briefing room, eyes hollow from months of relentless training. Colonel Harrison, a man whose very presence demanded respect, faced them with a grave expression. "You will be dropped into a 100-square-mile zone," he began, pointing to a large map marked with red XS. 7 checkpoints, 72 hours, no sleep, minimal food, and an elite hunter team will be tracking you. Get caught, call for help, or miss the deadline out. Understand this. The fastest anyone has ever completed this is 68 hours and 7 minutes. But don't think about records. Think about survival. Claire Donovan studied the map carefully. While the other candidates memorized the trails and debated routes, she saw something entirely different. Her mind mapped vertical paths, cliff faces, ridge lines, and hidden caves invisible to standard navigation. For years, she had lived by the rule that the best path isn't always the obvious one. At 0600 hours, they were deployed to separate insertion points. Helicopter blades roared above, kicking up clouds of dust and pine needles as Claire landed in a dense forest. The clock began ticking. While others bolted along visible paths, she melted into the terrain, moving like smoke between shadows. By the first night, the hunter teams were already closing in on the others. Thermal drones lit up with heat signatures of panicked candidates sprinting through valleys. But Claire? Nothing. She had scaled a cliffside the others deemed impassable, hiding in crevices where the temperature blended with the rocks, rendering her almost invisible to thermal detection. She reached the first checkpoint in under 5 hours. By the second day, she had cleared 4 more. Her movements were quiet and fluid, crossing dangerous ridges and crawling through cave networks where larger candidates simply couldn't follow. The instructors monitoring the exercise grew restless. "Where is she?" one of them muttered. "She's not triggering sensors." "Not even once," another replied, shaking his head. "It's like she's untouchable." Meanwhile, Morrison, clinging stubbornly to his pride, had already been caught by the hunter team. His disbelief was evident when he heard that Claire was not only surviving, but thriving. On the final night, Claire faced her biggest challenge: Echo Point, an exposed plateau with nowhere to hide. Every previous candidate who had made it this far had been captured in this final stretch. She studied the plateau from 2 miles away, crouched behind boulders, observing patrol patterns under the moonlight. Then she did something no one had considered. She went under the plateau. She had spotted a narrow cave entrance during her approach, a limestone tunnel that snaked beneath the surface. It was dangerous and uncharted, but Claire trusted her instincts. Crawling through jagged rocks and knee-deep water, she reached the hidden exit just below Echo Point. At 5:47, with only 13 minutes left on the clock, she emerged from the ground like a phantom. Before the stunned hunter team could react, she signed a logbook and activated her beacon. 54 hours and 11 minutes. 14 hours faster than the all-time record. The command post was silent. Colonel Harrison, watching the live feed, exhaled slowly. "She didn't just pass," he murmured. "She rewrote the rulebook." 2 weeks later, at the graduation ceremony, the surviving candidates stood in crisp uniforms, but all eyes were on Claire. Colonel Harrison pinned the Special Forces tab on her shoulder, his voice steady yet tinged with awe. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present Sergeant Claire Donovan, the first candidate in history to graduate with a perfect score. She has shown us that strength is not about size or appearance. It's about will. And hers is unbreakable." The applause roared, but Claire simply nodded, her gaze calm and distant. She didn't need to speak. Her journey had already said everything. Greatness doesn't shout. It doesn't demand recognition. It moves quietly, proving itself through action. Claire didn't win by arguing or seeking approval. She won by being undeniable. In the years that followed, her name became a legend whispered among new recruits, a story of how the smallest person in the room can cast the longest shadow. "Never underestimate the quiet ones," she would tell young candidates as an instructor years later. "Every laugh, every doubt, every insulted can all be fuel for the fire. The only question that matters is, are you determined enough to prove them wrong?"